Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2026. You are tuned in to round two of this amazing competition, currently in its second year. We've seen many wonderful matches so far, and this match is going to be the first match in this round. And I know that it is going to be an absolute treat. Good morning again, everyone. I am Ravon Thomas Matthews, and it is really a privilege to be here. Of course, I would not be here, nor would any of the teams or judges, if it were not for our amazing partners and sponsors. And so I'd like to take the opportunity right now to give them a special thank you. So, a big shout out to the University of the West Indies, the Center for Reparation Research, the UWI Press, Jade Limited, the University of Hull, and of course our main partner, the Repair Campaign. Now, joining me on my panel, we have some really amazing judges who I will ask to introduce themselves. Yes, starting with Miss Chantel Hughes.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chantal Hughes. I'm serving as a wing adjudicator today. Congratulations, gentlemen, for reaching round two. I'm looking forward to an exciting debate and very interesting arguments. All the best.
And of course, Jordana Denton.
Hi everyone, I'm Jordana Denton. All the best to both teams. I'm looking forward to an interesting clash of ideas. May the best team win.
Thank you very much. And we have a special treat for you, ladies and gentlemen. We have amongst our panel an auspicious guest judge, Dr. Chevy Eugene, a wonderful thought leader, subject matter expert, and really a consumerate philosopher in the fields of reparation, justice, and all things African. Dr. Chevy Eugene from Dalhousie University, we'll invite you to introduce yourself.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for having me. I feel very honored and blessed to be here to hear how you young people are thinking through and about reparations, reparative justice. So I'm very thankful to be here. So good luck. As was mentioned by Ravon, my name is Chevy Eugene. I'm originally from St. Lucia, now residing in Canada at the University of Dalhousie. And as was mentioned, my focus is on reparative justice. So all the best, have fun, and just be yourself and continue to and lean on each other, I would say, because that's what the reparations movement is about. Give thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Eugene. Now, I know that our debaters will not be intimidated by having such an excellent subject matter expert on the panel because they themselves have become mini subject matter experts. Speaking of our debaters, I'd love for them to introduce themselves. In proposition, we have the Queen's Royal College from Trinidad and Tobago. In opposition, the Wolmer's Boys School from Jamaica. Let's hear from our debaters, starting with our team in proposition, Queen's Royal College.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Joel Monroe, and today I'm the Prime Minister.
My name is Akash Raghu, and I'll be serving as the Deputy Prime Minister.
And my name is Ramon Walker, and I'll be serving as a member of government.
Wonderful. And of course, Wilmer's Boys School. We invite you to introduce yourselves.
Hi, I am first opposition speaker, Apollos Joyles.
I'm second opposition speaker, Kyle Kamika.
And third opposition speaker, Josh Nelcole.
All right, and there you have it, our 6 debaters for this match. The motion governing this round reads as follows. It's a juicy one. This House believes that quiet diplomacy is more likely to secure reparations than confrontational lobbying. Once more, this House believes that quiet diplomacy is more likely to secure reparations than confrontational lobbying. At this point in time, the teams know the format of this debate. If they didn't, they wouldn't have made it this far. But for the benefit of the viewing audience, I will go through it very quickly nonetheless. So, the first speakers will have 7 minutes to present their case. The second speakers from each team will have 6 minutes. And the third and final speakers from each team will have 5 minutes. It's important to note that during the first and last minute of each speech, we have something that we call protected time. During that period, you'll be protected from points of information, which means no points of information should be asked within the first and last minute of the first and second speeches, and no points of information will be allowed in the reply speeches. However, outside of protected time, points of information are not only encouraged, they're expected, and we're looking forward to them. And of course, unique to the Jade parliamentary format, we have 2 exciting periods of cross-examination. But I'll tell you a little bit more about the cross-examination period when we get there. And so, ladies and gentlemen, enough from me. You want to hear from your debaters. It is my great honor to call the first match of round 2 of the International Reparation Debate Competition to order. And to do so, we invite the first speaker from Queen's Royal College, Akash Raghu. The floor is yours.
Correction, before we continue with first opposition speakers introduced before, the first government speaker, is Gerald Monroe. That's correct.
All right, got you.
So I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Honorable members, we live in a world of sovereign states shaped by colonization and the transatlantic slave trade, yet bound together today by trade agreements, security alliances, and multilateral institutions. Formerly colonized nations now seek reparations from states with whom they remain economically interdependent and must continue cooperating on debt relief, climate funding, and global governance. Despite historical volatility, this global order functions through binding diplomatic agreements that sustain stability and development. Reparations are therefore sought as redress for centuries of exploitation and structural underdevelopment, not as charity, but as justice. And because states act through treaties and negotiated commitments, reparative justice must be pursued with this diplomatic framework. It is not symbolic lobbying, it is a sovereign process requiring consent, legislation, financing, and long-term implementation across governments. Our stance is clear. In the modern international system and societal context, quiet diplomacy is more likely to secure reparations than confrontational lobbying. According to the South African Institute of International Affairs 2008, the concept of quiet diplomacy is defined as structure, sustained state-to-state negotiations conducted through formal dialogue and strategic levering rather than public confrontation. This can look like CARICOM's 10-point plan, where Caribbean states pursue reparations through coordinated diplomatic engagement, and in Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which institutionalized justice through formal state processes rather than public coercion. In contrast, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 2024, defined confrontation lobbying as public pressure campaigns, media shaming, protest mobilization, and reputational attack designed to coerce compliance, visibility, and moral denunciation. This approach relies on external pressure rather than negotiated agreements. This can look like the protest during the 2020 visit of William, Prince of Wales, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, to Jamaica, and in pro-Palestinian demonstrations across the United States seeking policy change through public pressure rather than negotiation. The government understands that confrontational lobbying has its value. It raises awareness, it mobilizes grassroots energy, it reframes moral narratives. The US civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for equal opportunities for African Americans through mass marches, boycotts, and media visibility, forcing federal attention towards systemic discrimination, post-colonialism, and laying the intellectual groundwork for the later dialogue on reparations and post-colonial adjustments. However, something has changed from that period of time to contemporary society. In earlier eras, pressure movements operated within more contained political systems, where domestic protests could directly force legislative change. Today, reparations operate across sovereign states embedded in dense networks of economic and diplomatic interdependence. Governments calculate reputational costs, trade relationships, security alliances, and domestic political backlash simultaneously. Public shaming in this environment does not simply produce concession, it often produces entrenchment. Professor of Historical Geography Alan Lester's research on 2021 identifies 5 maneuvers used by the government to block reparations conversations: deflections, delay, moral equivalence, technical diversion, and denial. Public competition strengthens these maneuvers because leaders must avoid appearing weak before domestic audiences. Meanwhile, America's quarterly analysis of Caribbean reparations efforts in 2023 shows that programs under the CARICOM 10-point plan continues primarily to diplomatic channels, precisely because open hostility would jeopardize broader negotiations on climate finance and trade. Confrontation lobbying generates visibility, but visibility does not equal viability. It is for that reason that quiet diplomacy is likely to secure reparations, and I now advance 3 reasons why. First, quiet diplomacy reduces defensive entrenchment and keeps negotiation channels open. Public competition increases political audience costs. Leaders who are publicly accused are incentivized to resist to protect domestic legitimacy. Quiet diplomacy lowers the perceived threat, allowing incremental concession without reputational collapse. The Strategic Relations Analysis 2014 notes that low visibility engagement preserves flexibility and allows compromise that will be politically impossible under public scrutiny. Where reparations require consent from resistant governments, maintaining access to negotiation channels is indispensable. Second, reparations require structured technical implementation that only diplomatic processes can deliver. Reparations are not rhetorical acknowledgements. They involve legislation, physical planning, institutional design, monitoring systems, and long-term programmatic investment. The AAMC Health Justice Research from 2023 demonstrates that meaningful reparative frameworks require structured policy mechanisms such as targeted funding streams, institutional reform, and measurable equity programs. The NAACP's Reparations Framework 2024 calls for federal commissions and legislative action. Reparations are policy architecture, and architecture is built through diplomacy and negotiation. Third, quiet diplomacy aligns with modern interdependence and preserves broader strategic leverage. Former colonies and former colonizers remain economically intertwined. They negotiate trade agreements, climate commitments, development loans, and security partnerships simultaneously. The South African Institute of International Affairs 2008 study on quiet diplomacy showed that engagement strategies are often chosen when maintaining broader diplomatic relationships is strategically necessary. Caribbean states pursuing reparations cannot risk undermining other diplomatic relationships, as these ties are essential for the region's development and access to critical resources. Quiet diplomacy allows reparations to be integrated into wider negotiation packages, increasing leverage rather than isolating the issue in antagonistic confrontation. Within this approach, 2 additional strengths briefly support the argument: coalition-based multilateral pressure and long-term durability. Both points were developed later by my Deputy Prime Minister. When we weigh the 2 approaches explicitly, the distinction becomes decisive. Confrontational lobbying is effective at raising awareness, but ineffective at converting awareness into binding international commitments. It increases political defensiveness, strengthens blocking maneuvers, and risks collateral damage to broader cooperation. Quiet diplomacy, by contrast, reduces audience costs, preserves negotiation access, enables structured policy design, integrates reparations into broader strategic negotiations, builds multilateral leverage, and sustains implementation over time. In the world we described at the outset, a world of sovereign interdependence and institutional governance, the method that aligns with how international agreements are actually secured is the method more likely to succeed. That method is quiet diplomacy. Reparations require consent, legislation, funding, and durability. Quiet diplomacy directly facilitates those outcomes. Confrontational lobbying simply does not. For those reasons, this House should affirm the motion. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was the first speaker from Queen's Royal College, Akash Ragu. At this point in time, we invite the first speaker from Wolmer's Boys School, Apollos Giles.
Hi, I'd just like to clarify, am I audible?
Loud and clear, Apollos, and ready when you
All right, thank you. I will begin on my next word. I'll begin on my next word. All right, all protocols observed. The motion before us reads, this House believes that quiet diplomacy is more likely to secure reparations than confrontational lobbying. We just want to do a bit of clarification here. Confrontational lobbying, we have it as something that's organized, strategic, and institutionally challenged, or channeled, I should say, through public pressure. This includes various things like lawful protest, media campaigns, diaspora mobilization within Britain, parliamentary advocacy, and engagement at multilateral forums. So it's nothing chaotic or violence in that regard. And two, just as to clarify too, that quiet diplomacy, it doesn't have any sort of public scrutiny, and that's really and truly what it's hinging on for any sort of result. I'll start with some rebuttals here. The first thing is that opposition, I noticed that opposition, I say, their entire case assumes that diplomacy is producing results, but they actually prove it. right? If we look at things, the truth is that, you have things like CARICOM with their 10-point plan. It has existed for years, and Britain has not committed to any sort of binding, financial reparations, not to, compensation frameworks. And that's precisely the problem here, because that's precisely the problem with quiet diplomacy, because it produces process without any sort of pressure, any dialogue without deadline, and engagement without enforcement. And when you're asking a powerful state to accept historically liability that carries financial reputational costs, there's no rational incentive for them to prioritize, right, that issue unless refusal carries any sort of visible cost. So if quiet diplomacy was sufficient, the burden would already be shifting. But instead, the issue remains diplomatically parked, meaning their entire model just assumes effectiveness that reality does not demonstrate in real time. Another thing too is that they argue that today's interconnected world makes confrontation dangerous because states are embedded in trade and security alliance or whatever. But that logic actually strengthens foresight, because if you think about it, interdependence increases reputational sensitivity, in that you look at places like Britain today that rely on soft power, diplomatic credibility, and things like that, and international moral standing in ways that Imperial Britain never did, right? Meaning sustained public scrutiny across diaspora networks, media cycles, and international institutions multiplies pressure rather than isolates. And when reparations become a visible issue in debate parliament, it covered in British media, then you have that amplified result in that regard. So I'm moving to my first substantive now, which falls under the claim that quiet diplomacy is structurally incapable of overcoming the power asymmetry between Caribbean states and former colonial powers, whereas confrontational lobbying alters the incentive structure by raising the political cost of refusal. My first point here is that the power asymmetry actually makes quiet negotiation structurally weak. What am I talking about here, right? Reparations negotiations occur between small Caribbean countries or economies and former imperial powers with vastly greater fiscal, military, and geopolitical influence, right? And quiet diplomacy, the stronger party controls the tempo, the agenda setting, the procedural framing, so they can commission reviews, classify discussions as development partnerships, or shift talks into technical committees, or ever actually, making a binding commitment. And that's key here, because negotiations, when they're private, you're just delaying, the delay that comes with it carries no sort of reparational penalty, reputational penalty, I should say, right? Democratic governments, if you look at in Europe, they're electorally accountable to domestic taxpayers who may see reparations as a remote political inconvenience. And when talks are quiet, the leaders face no sort of domestic pressure to prioritize historical justice over contemporary policy concerns, I should say. And my second and third words are a bit of a two-stage process here. So the stage one is that public uproar generates political noise that small states alone cannot produce. Confrontational lobbying begins by creating public visibility, things like protests, diaspora activism, media campaigns, and multilateral engagement. And this stage is crucial because it's a case whereby small Caribbean states lacking natural leverage against global powers, whereby diaspora communities in Britain, France, as well as the Netherlands possess electoral presence, civil society networks, and media access. So reparations moved from that closed diplomatic into something that's broad and more than that public discourse, right? They become a live political issue rather than something that's a historical grievance, right? And that can just be indefinitely deferred, as we're seeing today. Public uproar, it reframes, as a result, it reframes the issue from something that's deemed as a bilateral annoyance, right, to moral controversy. In that you're generating scrutiny from opposition parties, the civil society organizations, and international bodies that may be concerned with the matter, and that noise cannot be replicated through quiet bilateral meetings. The second stage, very important, is that you have that uproar that I was just talking about. It converts into negotiating leverage for CARICOM. Why is it important here? The decisive link is that public mobilization it strengthens CARICOM's bargaining position, because once protests like international coverage and diaspora campaigns make reparations politically salient within these colonial states, Caribbean governments enter negotiations backed by visible public mandates and international attention. So they no longer perceive that these random supplicants requesting discretionary aid, but as a representatives of a cause that the colonizer's own public is then debating. So you have cameras, you have the parliamentary pressure that they come into place, and society pressure that pre-roll negotiations with costs. But Britain cannot quietly dismiss, not accept it, that will appear why Britain cannot quietly dismiss CARICOM when these refusals risk headlines for them, the domestic backlash, reputational damage, the public record here constrains future administrations then, because abandonment becomes politically visible rather than something that's diplomatically invisible. And that's the key term to note here. What are the impacts of this claim? Well, first, restructuring incentives increase for the probability of substantive concessions because governments act when the cost exceeds the cost of compliance. Second is that converting private dialogue into something that's public and in the open, that public controversy, it prevents an infinite delay across electoral cycles, which is historically how funding of reparations discussions start to begin with. And third, empowering CARICOM with the visible democratic backing transforms negotiations from asymmetric pleading into conditional bargaining, materially increasing our leverage. I'll get to my second substantive here, and it's that confrontational lobbying is more likely to secure meaningful reparations because reparatory justice requires public moral acknowledgement and legal framing, neither of which apply diplomacy can credibly deliver. What am I talking about here? Reparations are moral indictments against state conduct, not neutral parts proposals, and in democratic systems, leaders respond, right, when issues generate that reputational and electoral pressure. Quiet diplomacy suppresses that pressure by relocating the claim into confidential bureaucratic spaces where language is sanitized and the urgency of the matter and is really just diluted. Allowing governments now to treat reparations as just some sort of optional policy, foreign policy discussion rather than moral obligation, right? You have, that's it. I'd just like to mention too that you have confrontational lobbying brings that brutality to the foreground, exposing
All right, thank you very much. That was indeed the first speaker from the Wolmer's Boys School, Apollos Giles. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hinted at
Point of
something.
inquiry, Rev. One. Apologies for the interruption. We would have raised a point of information during their deliberation. We just want to know if it was audible to the rest of the call, in case it was not.
Yes, I could have heard your point of information, and I think they addressed it as well. Yes. So audio is good. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I was telling you about the cross-examination period, and I think it's going to be quite fun. So, for this period of the debate, what's going to happen is that we're going to have the opposition team pose questions to team proposition. Team proposition will answer those questions, of course. So, 3 questions, 3 answers. Each question can last no more than 10 seconds, and each answer from the team in proposition can last up to 45 seconds. It's also important to note that only one person on the team asking the question may do so at any point in time, but for the team answering the question, the entirety of the team can chime in to provide the most comprehensive and robust answer possible, as long as it fits within that 45-second window. So after team opposition has posed their 3 questions to team proposition, and they've been answered, we're going to flip the arrangement and invite team proposition to pose their 3 questions for opposition to answer. All right? So, with the rules of the cross-examination out of the way, we invite both teams to unmute their microphones. Yes? And we officially start this segment by inviting Wolmer's Boys School to pose their first question to Queen's Royal College.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, you can go ahead.
All right, so I'd like to begin my first question here. Under the model of quiet diplomacy, what specific incentive does Britain have to, prioritize operations when refusal carries no sort of electoral, reputational, or legal cost domestically for them?
I'm sorry, it came through a bit unclear. Could you repeat your question? So a bit different.
Go ahead and repeat.
Yes.
Okay, so look, my question is, under your model of quiet diplomacy, what specific incentive does Britain have to prioritize operations when refusal carries no electoral, reputational, or legal cost domestically?
So governments act on strategic interests. There are things like debt relief, climate leverage, regional credibility, and economic negotiation that reparations can be integrated into for broader diplomatic bargaining, making them materially rational and not merely moral. From your model of a moral projection onto governments, whether a government is lobbying for reparations or requesting reparations or being requested for reparations, it actually creates entrenchment and a backlash on both governments because of denial, as we have seen in past situations.
There's no pressure. If it is that there's no pressure mechanism from the public, how exactly are you going to force these big, these big countries to actually comply? What mechanism is there to actually force them to say, all right, we're going to give you reparations? You haven't mechanized that.
Well, as we can look from CARICOM's 10-point plan, which you mentioned in your speech, there's a lot of reason for lobbying for reparations. And when we speak of reparations, let's look first at the aspect of accountability and apologies. So we have governments like small island nations in the Caribbean as a whole applying for reparations through CARICOM, and there's public mobilization, but not necessarily public protest or media, use of media to, as you said, incentivize those initiatives because it's not necessary.
Last question here. You first speak about the whole claim of interdependence and the fact that it makes confrontation risky, but does that not also mean that the reputational damage thereafter spreads fast and therefore increases the leverage of small states that can generate through coordinated public advocacy?
Sorry, your question again?
I'm saying you claim that interdependence makes confrontation risky, but does that not also mean that reputational damage spreads faster and therefore increases the leverage of small states that small states can generate through coordinated public advocacy?
The relationships that we have could be damaged by that.
Yeah, your answer, Queen's Royal?
We're very sorry, but the audio is coming a bit distorted on our side. In terms of the last part of his question, keeps breaking off.
All right, so Wolmer's boys, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question again.
You claim that interdependence makes confrontation risky, but does that not also mean that reputational damage spreads faster and therefore increases the leverage of small states can generate through coordinated public advocacy?
Okay, thank you for the question. So actually no, because confrontational lobbying risks those interdependent relationships. As we've seen in the past, let's look at the UK, who was confronted time and time again to get reparations, and they rightfully stated that no, they're not apologizing, they're not giving any reparations, and it risks the diplomatic negotiations, the bilateral agreements that is already legislated, because the countries with the higher power could withdraw. You understand?
All right, thank you very much. That was the third question from Wolmer's Boys School. We now extend the privilege to Queen's Royal College and invite them to pose their 3 questions.
Well, we have to ask all 3 questions now. My question to the opposition is, if confrontational lobbying is your method of securing reparations, how do you manage the repercussions if these aggressions are not well received by the targeted government or organization in question?
Okay, so that's just statistically incorrect. What happens right now, we're seeing 40% of British citizens who insist that Caribbean nations require reparations, and I think 89% of them, I'm not even going to the full scope of this. So saying that these are very, very moral and pretty definite topics. Slavery was egregious, everyone agrees on that. And in forming process of this, it seems like a perfect gateway to get results.
And in addition to this, the collaborative effort approach has been utilized already. The CARICOM 10-point plan that you posit, it's actually something that was used in quiet diplomacy, and we've seen that it hasn't had much avail. And what we're saying on this side of the house is that there's no relationship to damage when these big countries continue to exploit these smaller countries by avoiding giving them their reparations. There's no relationship.
Okay, thank you. And our next question: could intense public-facing confrontational lobbying, as you have mentioned, harden the opposition and strengthen blocking maneuvers? And how do you reconcile that the evidence there is to show that governments use delay?
Repeat.
Can you repeat that? We didn't
go on, no problem. Could intense public-facing confrontational lobbying harden the opposition and strengthen blocking maneuvers, and how do you resolve the problem then?
I'm not sure if it's the internet connection. We still haven't heard what you just said.
Can you hear me clearly? Can you hear me clearly now?
Yes.
I repeat. Could intense public-facing confrontational lobbying harden opposition and strengthen their blocking maneuvers? And how do you resolve the problem?
Right, but what we're saying is that this problem actually exists on your side of the house in the present tense. So what we're saying is that they're already hardline, they're already against giving reparations in the current. And what we're saying is that if this approach of private sort of negotiations and this quiet diplomacy, if it's been employed and it's not working, we need to switch the approach. And we've mechanized you already why it is that it's likely to work on our side of the
Okay, also the fact that they can't really delay this. We understand how public defensive mechanisms, but it comes to a point where you have to clear to some extent to some degree of reparations because the public is on you. And we see that this also has electoral pressure on persons understand the severe consequences that slavery had and the need for reparations. There's going to be a political tie within Parliament, within British and Spain and French Parliament to turn towards reparations as a primary solution. So it has to eventually happen at the political or, that level. Yeah.
Okay, our last and final question. How does public shaming overcome the requirement for treasury approval and legislative consent in sovereign states?
Will you go again, please?
How does public shaming overcome the requirement for treasury approval and legislative consent in sovereign states?
That's something that occurs in negotiation, not quiet diplomacy. So what we're saying is that we rally the public to push these actors, these governmental actors, to actually repay these countries. And when it comes on to signing off documents to actually get the money from the treasury, that is something that happens during negotiation and not necessarily quiet diplomacy. They're different ideas.
Yes, exactly. It's a big difference between quiet diplomacy and negotiation. Symmetrical on both sides is negotiations, a natural part of finalizing the details. The question is how we get to that stage. And how we get to that stage is primarily through public advocacy and, of course, confrontational lobbying, not by just entering rooms blindly with individuals from a slew of Caribbean nations. Yeah.
All right, and thank you very much to both teams for that first period of cross-examination. At this point in time, we're going to invite the Queen's Royal College back to the stage with their second speaker, Ramon Walker.
Am I clearly audible?
Ready when you're ready, Ramon.
Thank you. Now, honorable members, this debate has never concerned the morality of reparations. We're past that. It concerns methods. The Prime Minister established 5 structural reasons why quiet diplomacy is more likely to secure reparations within the modern system of sovereign interdependence. Our burden remains comparative likelihood. Which approach converts historical injustice into enforceable agreement? With that clarification, I now turn to the opposition's claims. After hearing their arguments, it's become quite clear that the opposition is confusing the motion contrast that we are given between diplomacy and confrontational lobbying. I say this because they use negotiation as a strong point for their argument, when negotiation is clearly an act of diplomacy. I also asked the opposition if they're clear as to the difference between confrontational lobbying versus direct lobbying, because negotiation could underscore lobbying in the sense that it's direct, where, and I'll elaborate on that point, where direct lobbying, you have meeting with legislators, you submit bills within a formal system, not in the public eye, which means that there's where negotiation can come from, not from confrontational lobbying, when you go out in the streets and you have protests, or you have strikes, or you have things that are creating the visibility that you so want to implore, but it does not lead. Yes.
are you then saying that relying on goodwill from these big countries is more likely to actually achieve reparations? Is that what you're claiming? Because we don't feel that that counterfactual is actually realistic.
So you spoke a little fast, so you broke up in the end. Could you repeat your point of information?
I'm just saying, are you then saying that relying on goodwill is the most likely way to get these big actors to pay reparations because we don't believe that that counterfactual is realistic?
No, I'm not saying that we have to be reliant on goodwill. I'm establishing the difference between negotiation as a facilitator of diplomacy and not confrontational lobbying. It has nothing to do with goodwill. It has to do with the fact that one has a reliable outcome and the other does not secure the reliable outcome. Again, I'll elaborate that diplomacy includes a state-to-state negotiation. It's the actual definition. All right. Now, moving into another point that the opposition claimed, your argument is based on the fact that lobbying creates the pressure, as you stated, necessary to force governments into reparations, to secure reparations, as the motion is suggesting. But evidence shows that public pressure, it frequently triggers structured resistance and not compliance. There are 5 maneuvers governments use to block reparation debates and reparation agreements. That's deflection, that's delay, that's moral equivalence, that is technical diversion, and there's outright denial. So when the opposition says that quiet diplomacy is structurally incapable of achieving reparations because of that power imbalance, I introduce my next point, that the Caribbean is a perfect example that shows you how the power imbalance is neutralized. Let's look at CARICOM. It's a collaborative initiative between other member states that allows for the power imbalance to be neutralized. Moving into the second claim from the opposition, which, again, reliant on the fact that public embarrassment increases the international, cost, it increases the ability to secure reparations because of that visibility. Now, in reality, actually, reputational often it triggers or attracts nationalistic backlash. Leaders harden their positions to demonstrate sovereignty. And I'll quote from America's Quarterly, who explains that Caribbean states pursuing reparations under the CARICOM 10-point plan because open hostility risks collapsing dialogue entirely. Accepted?
Are you arguing for us? Do you realize that the power imbalance is actually on the side of the larger or the colonizer in this scenario? When these countries decide that, okay, we're not going to pay back these smaller countries because we don't want to be seen in a negative light in the public, so there's no mechanism on your side of the world that actually forces them to contend.
So there seems to be a lack of clarity in my deliberation. What I'm saying is that in the past, the confrontational lobbying that you are suggesting is what causes that backlash from colonial powers. You can look at the UK, where there was an outright protest against slavery and for the enslaved. And what did it create? Visibility. But where was the viability? So I'm not arguing for you. I'm stating quite simply that confrontational lobbying creates the backlash, and quiet diplomacy allows for conversation, it allows for dialogue, it allows for negotiation, it allows for systems that we can rely on that are already there. Now, moving away from the claims of the opposition, let us go back to the points that the Prime Minister laid out on the foundation for why quiet diplomacy is the method most likely to secure reparations. We have seen key points, but importantly, let's look at coalition-based multilateral pressure and sustained implementation, which provides structural strength and durability that confrontational lobbying cannot match. I will now build on this. First, quiet diplomacy enables coalition-based multilateral leverage that is structurally stronger than isolated confrontation. Reparations are rarely secured denied. Reparations are rarely secured bilaterally through moral accusation alone. They gain force when pursued collectively through coordinated regional blocs and institutional platforms. Looking back at CARICOM 10 points plan, which exemplifies this approach, by acting collectively, Caribbean states increase bargaining power. They share negotiating resources, and they embed reparations within international forums rather than framing them as hostile bilateral disputes. Now, the second point is that quiet diplomacy sustains long-term implementation. Confrontational lobbying is vulnerable to mobilization fatigue. Denied. Reparations are not one-time symbolic transfers. They involve fiscal planning, they involve development, they involve programming, institutional oversight, and generational commitment. Public movements rise and fall with media cycles that is being projected by the opposition. Governments change. News attention shifts. Diplomatic frameworks once formalized endure beyond protest momentum. Again, I'll raise the point the opposition made about the power imbalance, and I refuted that point with CARICOM 10-point plan. So I ask you, when governments change, how is this process sustained? How is this process sustainable, and is it able to go on for more and more years? Now, you said CARICOM 10-point plan isn't working. So what solution do you propose? Now, quiet diplomacy reduces defensive entrenchment. Confrontational lobbying may generate visibility. We acknowledge the opposition statement, but visibility without agreement does not secure reparations. The method that preserves negotiation space, builds leverage, secures legislative consent, and endures across time is quiet diplomacy. Thank you.
Indeed, and thank you very much. That was the second speaker from Queen's Royal College, Ramon Walker. Now, to extend the debate for team opposition, we invite Wolmer's Boys School's second speaker, Kyle Kamika.
Give me a second to set up my timer. Okay. Okay. I will begin in, okay. I begin in 3, 2, 1. Oh, hold on. 3, 2, 1. I'm second opposition for the motion. I'll start with the general buffers and get into my only claim. I want to start from up top from the frame of this debate. So initially they did this idea of the charity but justice. I want to say you frame the need for justice, yet governments are not producing it. The clear disconnect on their side of the house is not realizing how this process works. As much as they try to argue leverage, these are big countries, big diplomatic convoys, which naturally, because of their size and mass, even with the help of CARICOM, will naturally disadvantage in negotiations. They go out of goodwill. Why? Not only because of the difference in size. Let's say CARICOM and their combined efforts work. They work here because no one in the public understands or recognizes as reparations conversations. So what happens is that what these governments can do, or foreign governments can do, is phrase these negotiations and phrase these as these benevolent pills, and eventually solve the reparation process which happened in 2022 as well. I want to also clarify that CARICOM 10-point plan came about because of public intervention, public help, not necessarily because of these private negotiations. We also see that negotiations happen on our side, but we can give you the benefit of the doubt because we think even though negotiations on our side to actually bring us to this point of reparations, we have the pressure from a variety of institutions as well. I want to mention a point on accountability. You mentioned on your side, you don't really have accountability. In this vacuum, governments use their leverage in that politics in their favor. The counter mechanisms you propose don't avoid that harm. You don't necessarily avoid the harm of these persons using this for their own benefit per se. I'm going to go more to what the second speaker has to start with as well. So the main thing that you're coming off the bat here is that you're complaining about these enforcement agreements. You mentioned this idea of frame, even if you don't have negotiations, we still need to enforce the policies. Unlike your side, they use methods like procedure absorption and bureaucratic procedure. You also use it and interact and go for the cheapest type of reparations and continue conversations that peel away from reparations. You mentioned this in your first speech as well. We're talking about these continuous conversations. These continuous conversations, like happened with France's conversation with Haiti, they have these conversations, but they pivot away from reparations. They go into the benevolent agreements and make it seem as if they're being nice to these persons that have actually given reparations with responsibility attached to them. They also produce recommendations or non-enforceable documentation. A big issue on your side is you forget to realize that these countries, because they have this leverage which we have established from first speaker, they're able to have postulates which give recommendations, but don't actually have suggestions. That's that's to say essentially that you don't necessarily have postulates, or you kind of drive away the point that you don't actually want these things to be enforced. You necessarily want to do them as long as possible for the benefit of you. The biggest thing we have here is public pressure leads to defensiveness and government, and leads to defensiveness and leads to resistance, right? The responsible negotiation your side is really a spokesman. What a foreign negotiation is responsible. They use poverty with grant players as development aid or climate grants. This allows them to tell the voters to be generous and to be liable. And liability is a core tenet of this entire process. This happened in 2015. Global Cameron used to make a great $40 million for reparations, but instead was just deemed as benevolent payout instead of reparations and delayed reparations, and never actually gave reparations ever again. Also, I'm going to mention the fact if you say that there's a willing activation of national pride, as you mentioned from second speaker, the cost here. States only pay where the social and international cost of science becomes higher than the financial cost of field. National pricing is a shoe that is used to start for centuries. If we're polite, states are cold and rational actors, but do not worry, they're not paying billions of dollars with a sudden change of heart in a quiet room. They're only paying when they're forced to choose between financial field or total collapse of their international reputation. I think that happens more on our side because of the political argument I'm going to bring up as well. We also mentioned that wealth wasn't inferior and should be pointed out. So even if you're politically defensive mechanism of a moral standpoint, we resort to give these some sort of pushback because of that. And then we also know that we also mentioned the fact that slow progress, but we're actually making progress. This is not exactly the case. What quiet diplomacy has produced in the Caribbean context is not slow progress, it's institutional and regional progress where colonial governments run out the clock across political cycles. I won't go into my mind only claim to quiet diplomacy actively empowers colonial governments. Through quiet diplomacy, quiet diplomacy actively impose colonial government to start reparations indefinitely. Now, really, one here is political realities make negotiations to quiet diplomacy hard to maintain and easy to lose progress or substance. Few things here. The first of which is the cyclical nature of politics. Quiet diplomacy allows for each incumbent government to treat reparations as inherited legacy disputes from its predecessor. Resetting conversations, commissioning refresh views, and restarting the clock without consequence. There's no inherited pressure. We see this in 2024 with the UK government transition, where Prime Minister Kerr literally said that they're starting from zero and they're shifting to things like climate aid instead of reparation. There's no pushback right there. And how does this happen? So there's nothing like genuine anymore. And that's the main thing. There's a UK political party, there's a
All right, so we seem to be
right-wing versus left-wing parties that are different in dealing policies which aren't fair and do a change in government foreign policy on the match. Once I mentioned the fact that the use methods like the observe outcome operations and police recommend a lot because confrontation pretend the debt doesn't exist. The cost to not do this. We understand the cost on our side. We think have more cost on our side. You're reducing support to the publicity of non-compliance, increasing electoral pressure from sympathizers as well as pressure groups within and opposition parties as well. Also political pressure. Mention the fact that 85 and 40% of British persons support financial reparations, and 89% of them are aware that women enslaved people in the Caribbean for over 300 years. More public knowledge and slavery to public confrontation is even more political pressure. And there's scrutiny from bodies like the UN as well. To close off as well as going to my impacts, political dynamics such as cyclical politics make diplomacy ineffective and useless, allow for continuous stalling of regulatory policies. These dynamics don't apply to confrontational lobbying. With that, we rest.
All right, and thank you very much. We're now going to enter into the second period of cross-examination. This time, however, we're going to invite the proposition team, Queen's Royal College, to pose their questions first to the team in opposition. And so, ready for your first question, you are Queen's Royal College.
Are we clear?
Yes, you are.
All right. Our first question is, does this approach, meaning confrontational lobbying, fail to account for the legal complexities of sovereign agreements and international reparations?
Hi, could you repeat that? Sorry.
Just one more time. Are you hearing us clearly? Or is there still an echo? Okay.
All right. So our question is, does this approach, meaning confrontational lobbying, fail to account for the legal complexity of sovereign agreements and international reparations?
Okay, on the legal point, we think that for the most part, we get to the table, we actually get the incentive to push these persons to have the reparations in the first place. We think in terms of legal barriers, they don't exist at the point that you made them out to be. I also think that in these conversations, we don't have the legal barriers exist on their side because they insist on having suggestions instead of actual enactments. They insist on having postulates which are not really meant to be enacted, and they also have things like just benevolent people payouts instead of actually having things of that nature as well. Right? We actually have more pressure on ourselves.
Okay, so are you suggesting moral pressure can substitute for treaties, budgets, and institutional design?
Still didn't catch that one, yeah.
Let me see. They want to repeat. So in response to your response, we're asking, are you then suggesting that the moral pressure that is provided by confrontational lobbying can substitute for treaties, budgets, and things like institutional design?
Again, I think you're sort of confusing private diplomacy with what negotiation is. And so you're describing negotiation, which again happens on both sides of the world. But let's take that best case here. Even if you're saying that you guys have a more formalized method of getting to these actual policymakers and having them to create change, at the end of the day, when you get into these rooms, they're not going to listen to you because there's no pressure mechanism that is forcing them to say, hey, we have to act here. And outside of the house, the people, the citizens of both countries, both the colonizer and the colony, are telling them that, listen, this needs to happen. And so it pushes them more likely to have an impact or do something.
And also, let's look at the legal shift. On your side, reparations are framed as voluntary in the context of policy decision discussions. On our side, to public lobbying channel through the UN and International Court of Justice, we effectively bring these cases offsetting costs of international wrongful acts. So you have a legal shift there. And we can go to the UN and have those conversations international, which is still deemed as public advocacy. And we can also go through court proceedings with the International Court of Justice, which gives us these appeals to court settings. So we're still getting this.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. And just to clarify, we're not confusing negotiation with diplomacy. Diplomacy is negotiation. So my next question continues with, how would smaller or economically dependent, are you hearing me clearly? How would smaller or economically dependent states sustain confrontational campaigns without risking aid, trade, security, or diplomatic retaliation with confrontational lobbying?
Okay, two things here. The first of which is that most of these diplomatic ties are strictly on economic terms. For example, most of airlines from Europe have the most demand from Caribbean regions. They won't cut this, or governments won't cut this, because it affects their state inherently. So that economic tie won't be severed just because of something like this. Second thing, to prevent the backlash, we think for the most part, in terms of the backlash argument that you presented here, this type of backlash doesn't have to necessarily be this outspread or wider, this type of destructive type of agreements. It can simply be something that's small. Why does this happen in our situation? Because slavery is already going to be a bad enough historical precedent. So you don't need these large public or very radical public campaigns. We can have more campaigns which are just in four persons, and they will kind of comply in that.
Yeah, and just to reputationally speaking, we believe that colonial power actually retaliating economically against these small Caribbean states, the demand injustice would actually generate itself some sort of backlash, international backlash, itself, because the cost of over retaliation in an interdependent world is high. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. At this point in time, we invite Wolmer's Boys School to pose their 3 questions to the Queen's College.
All right, so our first question. You keep talking about, the quiet diplomacy produces quite reliable outcomes, but reliability, I should say, requires enforcement, and enforcement requires cost for non-compliance. So can you clarify what enforcement mechanism exists under your model if Britain decides that they're not paying, that paying reparations is politically inconvenient for them?
Thank you for that question. So to answer it, quiet diplomacy is what enables conversation and dialogue to take place. It is what institutionalizes reparations. You mentioned going to the UN and having discussions. Would that be possible with confrontational lobbying? The answer is no. Am I stating my opinion? No. I'm stating facts. The fact of the matter is that in historical examples, confrontational lobbying was only able to initiate the process of receiving any type of
reparations or legislative action.
Yeah, so we need diplomacy, which, as I would define again, state-to-state negotiation to secure reparations. Thank you.
Okay, or second question, you keep bringing this whole point that, we're speaking about negotiation, even though that wasn't the point that was brought. But even negotiation is simply democracy. What prevents Britain from negotiating perpetually without conceding liability? And how does your model actually prevent talks from becoming permanent procedural delay?
Honorable Opposition, can you please speak a little slower? Thank you.
All right, let me go slow here. If negotiation is simply diplomacy, that's what you're calling, what prevents Britain now from negotiating perpetually without conceding liability, and how does your model prevent talks from becoming permanent procedural delay?
We're so sorry, but from our end, it's coming through very distorted. So could you repeat one last time, please?
Before I do, I'd just like to ask, is that the case for anyone else, Ravon?
Yes, I am confirming that your audio is coming across echoed and muffled. If you can speak deliberately slower, that might help. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we seem to be having some technical difficulties, unfortunately. But Wilmers, when you're ready, your video was frozen and we couldn't hear you. If that's no longer the case, feel free to unmute and continue with a period of cross-examination.
Oh, so repeat the same question?
Yes.
If negotiation is simply democracy by means of your claim, what prevents Britain from negotiating perpetually without conceding liability? And how does your model prevent talks from becoming permanent procedural delay?
So I was actually able to hear your point on delay. And the thing is that from both perspectives, delay is inevitable. But why is delay worthwhile from the process of quiet diplomacy and not confrontational lobbying? My response to that would be that quiet diplomacy is for a sustained long-term result, whereas confrontational lobbying is something that burns out very, very quickly. Now, you mentioned the case of Britain, who we know has outright refused to give reparations and negotiations. And so my question to you is, how is that possible? Why did that happen? And the answer which I would provide is because of confrontational lobbying, because of constant public shaming of the British government. Even though they're worthy of it, it has caused them into entrenchment and backlash. Now, what would happen if we were to do quiet diplomacy, if we were actually able to sit down and negotiate terms with Britain for communication to be achieved?
The question is, prior to the last decade, for the last 50 years, your mechanism has not worked, has led to no binding agreements. Address that.
Of course. So let's look at examples, case studies where it has worked. So for example, let's look at South Africa, where a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established by Nelson Mandela. Now, what came out of that? There was negotiated systemic endurance, and victims received reparations through institutional reform. Now, I would like to mention for your case that there was a public outrage in South Africa, but it was not transformed until the act of diplomacy was ensued and employed. Thank you, Wolmer.
All right, thank you very much to both teams. That ends the second period of cross-examination. Now, at this point in time, the debate is going to pause for 1 minute. That 1 minute is to allow the finishing touches to be placed on these reply speeches, after which we will invite the opposition reply speaker, and following that speaker, the proposition reply speaker will conclude the debate. That 1 minute break starts now. Ladies and gentlemen, that is 1 minute elapsed. To conclude the debate for Team Wolmer's Boys School, I invite their third and final speaker, Josh Nell Powell.
Just confirming, am I audible?
I can hear you, Josh Nell.
All right, so let me just set up my timer really quickly. All right, I'll begin my speech on my next word. Mr. Speaker, the case of the proposition lies inherently on the goodwill of these large actors. I would believe that that is not likely to derive reparations because of the nature of it. In the absence of public pressure, the government broadly posits that they'll have these structural policy mechanisms to still generate leverage for these developing countries to use in negotiations to acquire reparations. But we believe that this is not likely. Firstly, this relies heavily on the goodwill from the more powerful country, and this creates a power imbalance in favor of the culprit. Really quickly, let me just point out that the proposition tells us that they provide pressure, but they still fail to contend with the nature of quiet diplomacy, which is that it still largely contends on, with goodwill. The sort of technocratic pressure mechanisms that they posit, it still exists behind closed doors, which obviously still provides the option of dissent from the greater party. And this again is a power imbalance which we believe cannot tangibly derive reparations. Again, Britain isn't likely to comply with this because in the absence of pressure, they're going to have economic impacts. Persons are going to pull away from trade with them if it is that they publicly apologize for slavery, if they admit their wrongdoing. They also have their reputational concerns, which again affects them both economically, politically, and the general public backlash is not something that they're going to move towards. And as a result of that, again, it's not likely. And another layer to that is that the collaborative approach that you posit proposition has already been tried and utilized. There is no avail and there's no relationship to damage with these big countries because the colonizers continue to avoid payment and continue to systematically exploit them. My second rebuttal here is on the point of achieving tangible reparations. Let me explain something to you. Ultimately, the nature of reparations is highly moral and ethics centered. It's not about aiming to derive the highest amount of monetary compensation through private negotiations. Second up would have showed us that Britain typically paints this as a benevolent payment or being nice to these small countries, and that is not reparations. Reparations centers on the principle of moral sentimentalism, and it is highly tokenistic. It's unrealistic to expect Britain to pay back every cent. In fact, I don't think they can actually calculate that every cent that was exploited or taken from these smaller countries in slavery. And so reparations goal, therefore, doesn't lie within how much repayment we can get, but accepting moral wrong and restoring this moral dignity to the people who were most adversely affected by colonialism. And even if we take your worst case here, we still are more likely to achieve monetary and tangible reparations on our side because of the fact that the pressure mechanisms that we outlined at first crop under our regime, these colonizer countries are forced to enter into these negotiations under the sort of leverage to these smaller countries, and so it is easier for those smaller countries to derive their reparations. Let me go into my clashes now. Firstly, we have goodwill versus pressure as a negotiation tool. I've told you what government said already. Let me tell you what the opposition is saying. Goodwill is not a negotiation tool when the power differential is so extreme that stronger party has no material incentive to concede to anything in private. Britain has had decades of quiet diplomatic engagement with CARICOM, and they've deflected every single time. We see this in the 10-point plan. Political will is not a product of goodwill, Mr. Speaker. It is a product of cost imposition. Every major reparatory settlement in history rallied off of the back of this fact. The analysis here is that the clash turns on whether a negotiation can actually produce meaningful outcomes when the party that faces the most consequences for its failure is the person who is asking for these reparations. And we believe that is not the case. Under quiet diplomacy, Britain faces nothing and it can defer indefinitely without any sort of political or institutional cost. Upwins this case because the government inherits a status quo of waiting for years only for diplomatic non-response to be the end goal. And we believe that this is not what should happen. The opposition does not need to prove that confrontation always works, but what we have proven is that it is always more likely to work than just going to these persons and asking nicely. That's not how it works. My second clash here is that reparations as a final transaction versus reparations as a public moral reckoning. I told you that reparations inherently is an apology. The government tells tells us that quiet diplomacy can secure material reparations in the form of development funds and debt cancellation. However, this money-centered approach does not materially translate reparations, because these countries can always just send these money to these smaller countries and still not say that, listen, we're accepting the moral blame for this colonial period, which is what it is. The opposition tells us that a payment made behind closed doors without any public acknowledgement of the wrong is not reparations, it's an off-the-book transaction. Reparations require Britain to publicly reckon with what they have done, and moral sentimentalism supports this. The analysis here is that this cash is definitional. If reparations are purely financial, as government would have you to say, they would actually have a case, but they don't, because reparations require acknowledgement, dignity restoration, and democratic accountability. And again, the opposition wins here, because CARICOM's own framework that they've been positing all debate, have you even read it, has told us that it is an all-encompassing public apology. The knowledge of these programs and psychological rehabilitation. The government's model satisfies none of these, and the opposition's model makes them unavoidable. We achieve reparations 9 times out of 10. You achieve it none. Thank you. We rest.
And thank you very much. That was the third speaker from Wolmer's Boys School, Joshua Powell. To conclude this debate, we invite the third and final speaker from Queen's Royal College, Gerald Monroe.
Honorable members, this debate has never questioned whether reparations are deserved. Both sides accept the moral premise. The true controversy lies in structure. In the world we actually live in, which method is more likely to secure reparations from sovereign states? To answer this, we must clearly rebuild the context. Quiet diplomacy relies on structured state-to-state negotiation, coalition leverage, and legislative engagement to secure and implement reparations over time, while confrontational lobbying depends on public pressure, media visibility, and moral denunciation to force concessions. Because reparations require legislative approval, institutional design, and budget mechanisms, and international negotiation between sovereign states, the approach that aligns with these structural levels is more likely to succeed. Our case is built on 5 points. First, on access to agreement, public confrontation raises audience costs and triggers delay, denial, and defensive entrenchment. Reparations require state consent, and consent is preserved through negotiation channels, not public escalation. On this foundational requirement, our argument wins. Second, on implementation, reparations demand legislation, fiscal allocation, and institutional oversight. Protests cannot pass appropriation bills. Diplomacy, however, engages the actors who design, fund, and sustain policy. On structural capacity, our model is clearly stronger. Third, on interdependence and leverage, reparations unfold within broader trade, climate, and development negotiations between economically intertwined states. Confrontation narrows bargaining space and isolates the issue. Coalition diplomacy, as seen through CARICOM's 10-point plan, multiplies bargaining power, embeds reparations within wider strategic negotiations, and institutionalizes the process at a multilateral level, ensuring continuity even when individual governments change. Now, allow me to address the opposition's claims. Their first claim was that quiet diplomacy is structurally incapable of achieving reparations because of power imbalance between former colonial powers and colonized nations. Now, I say to that it can, through coalition leverage and multilateral frameworks. Smaller states negotiating collectively increase bargaining power and embed reparation within broader trade and climate negotiations. The 10-point plan is a clear example of this. By acting as a bloc, Caribbean states strengthen their negotiating position and avoid isolation. Secondly, they also seem to misunderstand the definition of quiet diplomacy with regards to negotiation. There is no confusion between negotiation and quiet diplomacy. As we would have stated at the beginning of this debate, negotiation is clearly an element of quiet diplomacy. It's defined by the South African Institute of Initiative Affairs as state-to-state negotiation. So that clearly defines our stance. Visibility, again, ladies and gentlemen, is not viability. Leverage, consent, and institutional alignment determine outcomes, and on those measures, the government prevails. Confrontation may generate immediate visibility, but its impact is volatile. The recent lobbying efforts for reparations in Texas H.R. 40 and the Reparations No Resolution of 2025 mobilize advocates and media attention, yet face counter legislation such as the No Bailouts for Reparations Act and local funding bans producing no binding reparation outcomes whatsoever. Lobbying creates voice. Quiet diplomacy, however, secures enforceable, enduring commitments. In the world described at the beginning of this debate, a world of sovereign states negotiating within constitutional frameworks while balancing multiple strategic interests, the method aligned with those structures is the method most likely to secure reparations. Quiet diplomacy mirrors the mechanics of agreement, preserves negotiation space, builds leverage, and sustains commitments over time. Confrontational lobbying, by contrast, cannot achieve these outcomes. For all these reasons, the government's case prevails. Quiet diplomacy is not only the method most likely to succeed, it is a method that aligns with the structural realities of modern international negotiation. This House should affirm the motion, and I rest.
And thank you very much for concluding the debate, Gerald Monroe. Ladies and gentlemen, the judges have quite a bit of work to do. We're going to be excusing ourselves to another space, and we will return to you shortly with the results of this match and some feedback to the teams. Until then.
I'm the captain, Akash Ragu.
I'm Gerald Monroe.
And I'm Ramon Walker.
And we're representing Queen's Royal College. Now, we deserve reparations because the legacy of injustice is not historical, it is lived. It shapes our economies, our opportunities, and our communities right now. Reparations are not charity, they are accountability.
They are a measurable investment in repairing harm, restoring dignity, and securing a fair and sustainable future.
Because true justice doesn't only confront the past, it builds a sustainable world we should all inherit.
And repair cannot wait.
Hi there, my name is Apollos Joels and I'm acting as a representative of the Wolmer's Boys High School in Jamaica. And for us, reparations matter because we're still living with the effects of slavery and colonialism today.
Our ancestors' labor built welfare nations that still benefit from it, whilst communities they came from are still fighting to recover from the damage. Reparations are not about looking back with anger, they're about correcting an imbalance that still affects education, health, and opportunity.
We deserve a future built on fairness, not on the leftovers of history, and that's why reparations are necessary now.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this International Reparation Debate Competition. This International Reparation Debate Competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparations so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are, that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Equiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's Night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of a people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace the system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, Our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All protocols observed, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo, the history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Maroons, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debates which are already being done and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working, as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring 2 substantive. 1, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And 2, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival, reduces emotional harm, and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency, and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience, and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced, trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching hard history can be both emotionally and safe, intellectually enriching. According to a 2021 RAN Corporation study, students in these programs which is a reform program by the way, show that 94% increase in civic agency, meaning they felt more empowered to take social action and reported deeper empathy, stronger historical understanding, and more open-minded attitude. And the fact that we're seeing this in real classroom, Mr. Speaker, proves that harm is not inherent to the topic. It's about how we design the curriculum and support teachers, and we are currently doing this now through reform. If we have models that work, and we do, then the moral burden shifts to improving delivery, not erasing the content. What my third warrant is suppressing this history causes more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, be aware that we're not talking just about the current history. We're talking about the teaching of the history overall, because that's what the mood says. In environments where slavery is ignored or downplayed, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Students grow up believing that slavery was minor, that racism is just a mere relic of the past, or that systemic inequality is simply an overreaction. This ignorance sustains real-world harm, and contrary to this, we're seeing that countries like Germany, who have faced their history head-on with regards to the Holocaust, show lower levels of historical denialism and far-right extremism than those that whitewash. whitewash. The impact, it promotes social equity and activism, because when students learn this history accurately and empathetically, they become more socially aware, engaged, and ready to challenge injustice. And 2, it empowers empathetic, informed citizens who are empowered to fight modern injustice. And 3, it protects future generations from repeating injustice itself. My second substantive is silence enables racism to thrive. My first warrant is when schools avoid teaching slavery, they leave students with distorted or incomplete narratives. In the absence of formal education, when students are left to piece together understanding from biased media, peer opinions, or online misinformation, the result is a deeply distorted view of race and history. A 2018 SPLC report showed that only 8% of the US high school seniors could identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. When students believe that slavery was a voluntary arrangement or that racism ended in 1865, it undermines every effort to promote justice and equality today. Silence gives racism plausible deniability that it suggests falsely that if we don't talk about injustice, it must not exist. The impact, it ensures future generations, and with that, the proposition momentarily rests.
400 years ago. 400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what will be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice, rape and disgrace, blood rains, brute, force, ignorance, hate in their veins. Sweat and tears, labor revealed, produce from king fields only for the esteemed. 400 years of eroding one's pride, culture, heritage, value. 400 years of the iron chain, stringing up, leaving bare. Oh, but they never cared. Why fight when you would be met with sharp blades? So don't you dare cry out in fear. Why not plan escape with the plaiting of one's hair? Oh, the drums, listen, dance, communicate. For tonight we fight a battle not even death could spare. Blue eyes, white skin, master said there's beauty within. But guess what? Black, brown, gold, royalty, reparations, we are owed. Them say hassa, but we say cassava. That's where we get the strength from to beat and conquer. For tonight, we're returning to Ghana. You may say, I'm a descendant of slaves because of the rich melanin that gushes from my pores. But I came to tell you tonight, I am not a slave. Rather the descendant of kings and queens. I am the embodiment of the divine. I do not chase, I align, I attract. What's meant for me already has my name on it. I am the personification of beauty, the expression of love, the creator of life, the acknowledgement of freedom. So go ahead, call me what you want, because when I die, bury me in the oceans where my ancestors jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage.
This is something that I wanted to discuss since Emancipation Day, but did you know that Britain only finished paying for slavery in 2015? Yes, 2015 as in 10 years ago. This fact was revealed in a since deleted tweet back on February 9, 2018 by the then Her Majesty's Treasury. In 1833, Britain borrowed 40% of its national budget, £20 million, to finance the Slavery Abolition Act. This act was the official end of British slavery and went into effect on August 1, 1834. The money that was borrowed was used to repay British slave masters for their quote-unquote loss of property. However, for the enslaved, there was no repayment and no form of compensation was offered. The amount that was borrowed, the £20 million, was equal to £2.2 billion in today's money. The since deleted tweet from Her Majesty's Treasury pointed out that the taxes paid by people today was used to repay the loan that paid the slave masters. This would mean that people from the Windrush generation and their descendants, people from Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago and other British colonies, would have helped to repay the loan taken out to pay the people who enslaved their ancestors. Using this video, I want to highlight that when people say that slavery was so long ago, 400 years ago, ancient history and we should get over it, we can see that it wasn't that long ago. If we look at a timeline of the history of Barbados, we can see that chattel slavery in Barbados lasted 207 years. whereas the time from emancipation in 1834 to today is only 191 years. So as a nation, we've spent longer in slavery than we've spent free. I want you to think about that. Facts like these are why people have started a call for reparations to correct an injustice done to us as a nation, a region, and a people. If you want to learn more about reparations and how you can be involved, click the link in my bio.
What you take, give it back. Stolen riches, give it back. My name, you changed that. Your hate, keep that. My land, where's that? Green pastures now flat. Your greed did that. My religion, you stop that.
The African emancipation experience is a story of resistance and breakthrough, so that I could stand before you and speak to you because my ancestors paid the price for me. So when you look at me, see not just African beauty, but freedom in its entirety, where black is beautiful and freedom is opportunity, where people who look like me can be celebrated equally. Don't be distracted by my melanin. This skin that was once frowned upon is now flourishing. And if you know not to which I am speaking, then let the history lesson begin. To understand where we're going, we must first understand where we come from. So for some, this story begins at the bottom of a ship, forcefully migrated from the motherland as human cargo, an economical decision to work on a sugar plantation, and so slavery began. Beaten mercilessly, and regardless of sex, they were all treated as property. Can you imagine what it would be like to not be in control of oneself, to have your very life determined by somebody else? And if you want to talk about human rights violations, slavery is the definition. Punishment, imprisonment, torture, mutilation, sold without hesitation, separated from tribes to limit communication, and if you even harm an African ritual master could have your tongue for that. So on the plantation, it had none of that. We did what we were told, no questions asked. After all, slavery was an organized business and we were just labor. To work without receiving a dollar, branded and assigned Christian names didn't make it any better. But I am the prayers of my ancestors answered. A strong black African woman whose voice has the power to command even the boldest man, whose power comes from purpose, whose pain has inspired passion. So every African descendant walking confident continues to break the chains of a cycle. On August 1st, 1838, my generation was molded in hope, paid for in sacrifice, bought in tears. So when these heirs hear the words African emancipation, can we understand the dedication of our ancestors' contribution to civilization? Because these doorways to freedom that we walk through so gracefully was paid for with the life of your mummy's mummy. So I wear my African heritage proudly, as this poem speaks to who we are, who we were, and who we will be. And since I get to decide, I will take my African emancipation walk in stride. Stand with me. Side by side, black woman to black man, black boys to black girls. Let our stories be told with honor. Let the skin be celebrated in boldness, for in the end, this story was always destined for greatness. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparations so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. The judges are here and we have the final result of this match, match one, round two of the International Reparation Debate Competition. So, what did the judges see? The motion before us read, this House believes that quiet diplomacy is more likely to secure reparations than confrontational lobbying. So there was definitely a bit of a definitional challenge that existed within the debate. See, Teams Queen's Royal College tells us that quiet diplomacy is something where negotiation can only exist within quiet diplomacy. They give us a definition of what quiet diplomacy is, which includes the word negotiation. And that Queen's Royal College contends, it makes it mutually exclusive to them that you cannot have negotiation in confrontational lobbying. The judges didn't necessarily agree with that, and neither did Wolmer. Wolmer says that we can absolutely have negotiation at the point in which our confrontational lobbying has been successful. Similarly, on the question of whether or not we can go through multinational and multilateral organizations through one means or the other, the judges would have concluded that both mechanisms, whether it be quiet diplomacy or confrontational lobbying, can absolutely occur at the multilateral level or at the bilateral level. It really doesn't change just because of what you're doing. The question is, how are you going to be doing the thing that you're doing? That is a pivotal question in the debate. So then what did we get? We got this idea from Team Queen's Royal College that what happens when we have confrontational lobbying is that individuals become resistant. The parties become resistant, the countries become resistant, and they're less likely to want to engage. We hear from Team Wolmer that it is that kind of emphasis behind the resistance that we want. We want them to be upset. We want to shame them and we want to embarrass them. And so the clash became one of goodwill versus embarrassment. And in the interest of time, there's so much I could say, but I'm not going to be have the opportunity to say all of it. So how did it fundamentally pan out? Well, we heard that there is a power imbalance that exists, Wolmer's contends, and a power imbalance between the super powerful former colonizers and us is a really bad power imbalance, right? And that's something that is just not going to work with quiet diplomacy. They have no reason to do anything for us because they have all the power. Queen's Royal College contends, well, no, because we have institutions such as CARICOM and other multinational organizations and other blocks that can come together and make us a collectively stronger bargaining force. And that is going to make that power disparity significantly less. The judges bought that. The judges believe that. And so then what do we have remaining in the debate? There's so much more, but for the purposes of my OA, again, keeping it short, the debate comes down to a particular clash, right? Do we get better outcomes via goodwill? Do we get better outcomes instead through confrontational lobbying? And so, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of what was a long period of deliberation, the decision coming back from the judges is unanimous. All 4 judges agreed on the call. And we believe and know that the team that won this match on a score of 274 points to the losing team's 271 points, the team that will be securing an automatic advancement to round 2 of this competition, rather round 3 of this competition, comes to us from the proposition, and that is the Queen's Royal College. Congratulations, Queen's Royal College. Well played, Wolmer's Boys School. The best debater from this match comes to us actually from Wolmer's Boys School. The majority of the panel thought that this was the best debater. And that is the 3rd speaker from Wolmer's Boys School, Josh Nell Powell. Josh Nell, we thought that you were clear. We particularly loved your analysis of the issue, your analysis of the clash of goodwill versus pressure. And we thought it was really interesting how you reframed that the purpose of reparation is an apology, not necessarily material goods, and how we can only achieve that from your side of the house. We thought that was good. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this match 1 in round 2 of the International Reparation Debate Competition. Join us in a few minutes where we will see match number 2 of this competition. This match will feature 2 more amazing teams. Queen's College Guyana going up against St. Joseph's Convent, Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. The motion, this house would prioritize internal social reform over pursuing reparations from former colonizing states. I'll see you in a few minutes.
No. Hi, Rabban, just asking, is it possible that we can
Congratulations, guys. It was a good debate.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Wolmer, and thank you for debating with us. It was indeed a pleasure, and we hope to see you again sometime soon.